In 1692, the small town of Salem was consumed by fear. Whispers spread through the streets. Neighbors turned against each other, and a single accusation could become a death sentence. In this video, we follow the terrifying story of a woman accused of witchcraft during the Salem Witch Trials, a time of paranoia, hysteria, and brutal injustice that shocked colonial America. Before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more dark and fascinating stories from history. Now, let us return to Salem, where fear ruled everything. There is a particular kind of quiet that lives only in winter mornings, a stillness so complete that it seems the whole world has drawn a breath and chosen, for just a moment, not to release it. Mercy Olcott knew that quiet well. She would wake before the light, before even the birds stirred in the frozen eaves of her small house, and she would lie still in the dark and simply listen. The tick and settle of the hearthstones cooling from the night before, the far-off sound of wind curling around the corner of the woodshed, the soft weight of the wool blanket across her chest, rising and falling with each slow breath she took. It was in those moments, she always thought, that God seemed most present. Not in the thundering sermons of Reverend Paris, not in the hard pews of the meeting house where the cold came up through the floorboards and settled in your bones by the second psalm, but here, in the dark, in the breathing silence of a winter morning, before the world remembered itself and its troubles. She was 28 years old in the winter of 1692, a widow these 3 years, since Thomas Olcott had gone into the ground with a fever that no amount of willow bark or cool compresses could persuade to leave him. She had grieved him truly and deeply, and then she had done what women in her position were expected to do. She had kept going. She had kept the house. She had kept the garden. She had kept herself. The house sat at the edge of the village proper, where the road bent southward and the pine trees began in earnest. It was not a grand house, 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft above, with a root cellar beneath where she kept her dried stores through the winter. But it was hers. Thomas had left it to her cleanly, without contest, and she had poured herself into it the way water pours into a vessel it was made for. The garden was her particular pride. Come spring and summer, it sprawled behind the house in a manner that some of the village women found slightly excessive, neat rows of kitchen herbs giving way to medicinal plants, which gave way in turn to a wild corner she had left deliberately untended, where chamomile and elder and yarrow grew as they pleased. She knew each plant by sight and smell and season. She knew which leaves to dry in bundles hung from the kitchen rafters, and which roots needed to be put up in lard, and which flowers were best steeped fresh. Her mother had taught her these things, and her mother's mother before that. It was not magic. It was simply knowledge, the accumulated, careful learning of women across generations who had understood that the earth, if you listened to it, had much to offer. She did not think of herself as unusual. She went to church. She said her prayers morning and evening. She paid her tithes. She helped when she could a poultice here for Goodwife Holden's bad knee, a packet of dried lavender there for the nurse family when their youngest could not sleep. She asked for nothing in return, though sometimes she received eggs, or a cut of salt pork, or simply a warm word at the meeting house door. She was not entirely without friends. There was old Rebecca Nurse, who lived farther down the Ipswich road and who had always looked at Mercy with a kind of gentle recognition, the look of one quiet woman acknowledging another across a room full of noise. There was Young and Putnam, though that was a more complicated sort of friendliness, and Mercy had learned over the years to hold it at a slight distance, the way you might hold a candle when you weren't certain of the draught. And there was Samuel, the blacksmith's apprentice, who had taken to stopping at her gate on Tuesday mornings when he passed by on his way to the forge, and who had a habit of finding reasons to linger a few minutes longer than was strictly necessary. She did not permit herself to think too carefully about Samuel. That way lay a tenderness she was not yet certain she could afford. But on that particular morning in early January, a morning like the ones she had lain in so many times before, listening to the silence, she was not thinking of any of this. She was thinking about bread. She rose as the first gray light began to feel its way through the shutters, dressed quickly in the cold, and set about the business of the morning. The fire needed building up from its embers. The water bucket had a skin of ice that needed breaking. The cornmeal wanted measuring out for the morning's hasty pudding, and she was nearly out of molasses, which she made a note to remedy at Ingersoll's ordinary before the week was out. These were the textures of her days, and she moved through them with an ease that came from long practice, not joylessly, but without ceremony. There was a deep satisfaction in doing ordinary things well, in the bread that rose as it should, in the fire that caught cleanly on the first attempt, in the way the kitchen filled slowly with warmth and the smell of wood smoke and the gentle bubble of the pot. She hummed sometimes, without noticing she was doing it, hymns, mostly old ones, the kind that had no particular beginning or end, that could be stretched out across the length of a morning's work like a length of good cloth. Her voice was low and unremarkable, not the kind that would distinguish itself in a choir, but it pleased her, and there was no one to hear it but the cat. The cat was called Patience, which was either a virtuous name or an ironic one depending on the day. She was a gray, self-possessed creature who had arrived at the house 3 winters ago during a particularly bad storm, and who had never left, and who regarded Mercy with the particular combination of affection and indifference that only cats can manage. She sat now on the bench near the fire, watching the bread preparations with an expression of cool assessment. "You have had your breakfast," Mercy told her. Patience blinked once, slowly, and turned to look at the wall. Outside, the world was beginning to lighten, not warmly, not like summer light that spills and floods, but carefully, as winter light does, measuring itself out in thin gray portions. Mercy could hear, faintly, the sound of someone else stirring. A door somewhere down the road. The distant complaint of an ox being led to water. The village was waking. She did not yet know, could not have known, standing there in her kitchen with flour on her hands and her breath still visible in the cold air, that the village was waking into something different this winter. That somewhere, in the Paris household not far from the meeting house, 2 girls had begun to behave in ways that no one could explain and everyone would try to. That a word was forming itself in the cold air of Salem village, a word that would grow and spread and devour everything it touched. She did not know any of this. She knew only that the bread needed another minute, and that she was nearly out of molasses, and that today she had meant to replenish her stores of dried rosemary before the worst of the winter set in. She knew the particular pleasure of standing in her own kitchen in the early morning, with the fire going and the cat watching and the light coming slowly through the shutters. She knew that she was, on balance, content. Hold that image gently, if you would, Mercy Alcott, flour on her hands, warmth at her back, the world quiet outside her door. Because it is the last truly untroubled morning she will remember. In a small village, news does not walk. It runs. It runs down frozen roads and slips under doors and leans itself across the counters of ordinaries and finds its way into the ears of women at their spinning and men at their wood piles. And by the time it has made its full circuit, it has changed shape so many times that it bears only a distant resemblance to the thing it started as. Mercy had lived in Salem village long enough to know this. She had seen a rumor about a disputed boundary line keep half the village occupied for the better part of a summer. She had watched a piece of news about a merchant's failing business transform, over the course of a single week, into a story involving gambling, a woman in Boston, and a horse that may or may not have existed. She was therefore not immediately alarmed when she began to hear, in the last days of January, that something was the matter with Betty Paris. Betty was 9 years old, the minister's daughter, a small, round-faced child who Mercy had seen at church every Sunday without exception, sitting in the front pew with her hands folded and her eyes forward with the particular obedience of a child who has been carefully instructed in how to be seen. She was not a child Mercy knew well. The Paris household kept itself at a certain remove from the village's more ordinary social life, which was understandable, perhaps, for a minister, though it did mean that Reverend Paris was better acquainted with the failings of his congregation than with its kindnesses. The first version of what Mercy heard was simply that Betty had been unwell. A winter chill, some said. A fever that had come on suddenly and refused to break. This was not unusual. Winter in Massachusetts was not gentle with children, and there was hardly a household in the village that did not lose someone sooner or later to one illness or another. She thought of it only briefly, offered a small, private prayer for the child's recovery, and went on with her days. January passed into February without much ceremony. Mercy spent those weeks largely indoors, as one did. There was mending to see to a long, patient task she had always found oddly soothing, the rhythmic pull of thread through cloth, the quiet satisfaction of making a thing whole again. There were dried herbs to sort and repackage before their potency faded. There was a loose stone in the hearth that needed reseating, which required a morning's work and left her hands scratched and her temper briefly tried. She read, when the light allowed. She had a small collection of books, the Bible, of course, and a psalter, and a well-worn almanac from 3 years prior that she returned to more for comfort than for information, and a slim volume on the cultivation of medicinal plants that had belonged to her mother and that she had read so many times the binding had separated and been retied with a length of twine. She visited Rebecca Nurse on a Thursday afternoon, walking the Ipswich road through a light, steady snowfall that muffled the world to a whisper. Rebecca was in her 70s now, and the cold lived in her joints in a way that made Merce's visits useful as well as pleasant. She brought a salve of comfrey and rendered fat that Rebecca applied to her hands each evening, and in return Rebecca made tea and talked, which was a trade Mercy considered more than fair. It was Rebecca who first gave her a fuller account of things. "They are saying the Paris child fits," Rebecca said, over the steam of her cup. Her voice was even and unhurried, as it always was the voice of a woman who had lived long enough to have learned that alarm rarely improved a situation. "And the niece as well, Abigail." "Fits," Mercy repeated. "Convulsions. Crying out. Strange postures. They say the body bending in ways a body oughtn't." Rebecca wrapped both hands around her cup. "Dr. Griggs has been. He says he can find no natural cause." Mercy was quiet for a moment, watching the snow against the window panes. "Children sometimes have fits," she said. "There are herbs that help with that. Valerian, taken in small doses. Skullcap." "I know it." Rebecca looked at her gently. "But Griggs has not asked for herbs." There was something in the way she said it that sat uneasily. Mercy turned it over in her mind on the walk home, her footsteps leaving dark prints in the new snow, the light going early the way it did in February, the trees turning to black shapes against a sky the color of pewter. No natural cause. She thought she understood what that meant. She did not yet understand what it would set in motion. By mid-February, it was not just Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. and Putnam had begun to suffer similar afflictions and was 12, the daughter of Thomas Putnam, who was among the more prominent men of the village, or at least among those who considered themselves so, which Mercy had learned were not always the same category. Then Elizabeth Hubbard, then Mary Walcott. One by one, like candles being lit from a single flame, the girls of Salem village began to fit and cry out and press their hands to their heads as though something invisible were tormenting them. The village, which had briefly treated it as a matter of illness, quietly shifted its interpretation. Mercy noticed the shift the way you notice a change in the quality of light, not all at once, but gradually, and then with a growing certainty that something had altered that you could not easily name. The conversations at the ordinary were different. The silences at the meeting house were different. People looked at one another with a new kind of attention, watchful and anxious, as though they were reading signs in ordinary faces that had suddenly become texts in need of interpretation. She tried to place herself outside of it. This was not difficult. In some ways she lived at the village's edge. Her days were her own, and she had never been the kind of woman who found herself at the center of things. She went to church. She greeted her neighbors with the same measured warmth she always had. She continued her mending, her reading, her long quiet mornings. But she noticed things. She noticed that when she mentioned valerian or skullcap or any of the other remedies that might have helped the girl's symptoms, the responses she received were politely deflecting, as though the question of what ailed the girls had already been settled in a register that herbal knowledge could not reach. She noticed that when she walked through the village now, there were occasional pauses in conversation that had not been there before. Glances exchanged. The social fabric of a small community, usually so transparent, had acquired a texture she could not quite read. She noticed that in Putnam, who had once lingered at her gate to chat about inconsequential things, now passed without stopping. She did not, at this point, believe that any of this had anything to do with her directly. She believed, or tried to believe, that she was observing a community in the grip of something collective and strange, something that would pass, as such things passed. She had read about witch panics, vaguely, in the old almanac. She knew they had happened in Europe. She knew the learned men of those times had later looked back on them with something between embarrassment and horror. She thought, this is a difficult winter. People are frightened. This will resolve itself. She thought, I am not part of this story. She stood at her kitchen window one evening in late February and watched the snow coming down in the dark, great, slow flakes falling without urgency, and she felt, for a moment, that peculiar stillness she loved, the sense of the world holding its breath. And then Patience the cat, who had been sitting on the windowsill beside her, made a soft, uncertain sound, not quite a cry, not quite a question, and turned away from the glass. Mercy stayed where she was a moment longer, watching the snow. She did not know, then, what she was watching for. The first name was Sarah Good. Mercy heard it on a Tuesday morning, from the wife of the cooper who lived 3 houses down, who had stopped her at the road's edge with the breathless urgency of someone who has been holding news in their mouth all morning and can no longer manage the containing of it. Sarah Good was a beggar woman. That was not a cruel assessment, it was simply the truth of her situation, and the village knew it plainly. She went from door to door asking for food and lodging, her husband unable or unwilling to provide reliably for her, her children thin and watchful. She muttered to herself as she walked, which some people found unsettling and others found merely sad. She was the kind of woman a village tolerates at its margins, neither truly belonging nor entirely excluded, existing in the uncomfortable space between charity and contempt. She was, in other words, exactly the kind of woman who could be named without much resistance. The second name was Sarah Osborne Older, bedridden much of the time, rarely seen at meeting, which had always been quietly noted against her. And the third name was the one that sent a particular chill through Mercy's chest when she heard it, standing in the road with the cooper's wife's words still hanging in the cold air between them. Tituba, the Paris family's enslaved woman. Mercy had seen Tituba only a handful of times, a quiet, careful presence at the edges of village life, a woman who carried herself with the particular contained dignity of someone who has learned that visibility invites trouble. She had always struck Mercy as profoundly unremarkable, in the way that people who are simply trying to survive tend to seem unremarkable to those who are not watching closely enough. They say she confessed, the cooper's wife told her, leaning forward slightly, her voice dropping to the register people use when they want to make clear that what they are saying is important. She confessed to it, to consorting with the devil, to flying, to signing his book. Mercy looked at her for a moment. She confessed, she said, freely, in the examination, before Magistrate Hathorn himself. Mercy thought about what freely meant for a woman in Tituba's position, standing before a magistrate, with the minister who owned her watching from the room. She thought about what the consequences of denial might have looked like, set beside the consequences of confession. She thought about how a person calculates survival in a room full of people who have already decided what they believe. She said none of this. She said, God have mercy on us all, which was both true and sufficiently noncommittal, and she continued on her way. March came in with a cold that had teeth. The examinations were the talk of every gathering, the meeting house steps after Sunday service, the ordinary, the road. People who had not previously spoken much to one another found themselves in long, low-voiced conversations. There was a quality to it that Mercy recognized, though she struggled to name it precisely. Not quite excitement that was too simple, too uncharitable. Something more like the collective held breath of a community that has found, in shared fear, a kind of unity it did not previously possess. She kept her distance from the talk as much as she could, which was not very much, because a small village does not offer great expanses of distance from anything. She went to the examinations once not to watch with appetite, but because Rebecca Nurse had asked her to come, and because she trusted Rebecca's judgment about what was worth witnessing. They stood at the back of the packed meeting house, the air close and warm with the press of bodies, and watched as the afflicted girls sat at the front, and the accused stood before the magistrates, and the proceedings moved forward with a terrible, grinding momentum. What she saw troubled her in ways she found difficult to articulate afterward. The girls performed their suffering with a conviction that was either entirely genuine or something else altogether, and Mercy found she could not determine which, and suspected that the distinction might not matter as much as it should. When the accused spoke denying, explaining, pleading, the girls cried out, or twisted, or covered their eyes, and the room shifted toward them, away from the speaker, like a plant turning from shade toward light. The magistrates asked questions that already contained their answers. She noticed that. She noticed that the form of the questioning was not, "Did you do this thing?" but rather, "How long have you done this thing? When did you first meet the devil? Whose shape did you send to torment these children?" Questions that assumed guilt and merely sought its elaboration. Questions that left no honest doorway for innocence to walk through. She walked home from that examination in silence, and Rebecca walked beside her, and neither of them spoke for a long while. And when they did, it was about small, careful things: the state of the road, the likelihood of more snow, whether the early crocuses would manage to come up through the frost this year. There are conversations that cannot be had in the open air of a village where everyone knows everyone's business, and the word which is being used like a key that opens every lock. It was the second week of March when Mercy heard her own name for the first time. She was not present when it was spoken. She learned of it afterward. And the manner of her learning was this. Samuel, the blacksmith's apprentice, came to her gate on a Wednesday morning instead of his usual Tuesday, and he stood there for a moment before speaking, turning his hat in his hands with the careful attention of a man who is arranging words. She watched him from the doorway. He was perhaps 24, with a broad, honest face that had never learned to conceal what he felt, which was both his great virtue and, she suspected, an occasional inconvenience. "I heard something," he said, "yesterday, at the forge. Thomas Putnam was there with his brother, having a shoe replaced." She waited. They were speaking of the examinations, of who else the girls had named. He paused, turned his hat once more. And Putnam, the daughter, had said something in her fits, about a woman at the edge of the village. A widow woman who knew too much about plants and kept to herself. He looked up at her. "They did not use your name directly, but—" the word but sat between them in the cold air. Mercy was quiet for what felt like a long time. She was aware of the door frame beneath her hand, the solid, familiar wood of it, slightly rough, the grain she knew by touch. She was aware of the sound of the wind in the pine trees at the edge of the property. She was aware of the particular quality of morning light on the road, thin and pale and entirely indifferent to what was being said beneath it. "Thank you," she said at last, "for telling me." He looked as though he wanted to say more. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the not-quite stillness of his hands. But he was a young man with good instincts, and his good instincts told him, correctly, that there was nothing more to be said that would be useful. He nodded once. He put his hat back on. He walked away down the road, and she watched him go. And then she went back inside and stood in the middle of her kitchen for a moment without moving. The fire was going. The bread from the morning was wrapped in cloth on the table. Patience sat on the bench and watched her with those flat, golden eyes. "They did not use your name directly. But," she thought, "perhaps it is nothing. A child in distress speaks without precision. A conversation overheard is never the whole conversation." She thought, "Perhaps I should speak to someone, to the minister, to a magistrate, to explain that she was a faithful woman, a church-going woman, a woman whose knowledge of plants was inherited and ordinary and entirely without malice." She thought, "And would they hear me?" She reached out and touched the spine of her mother's book, still tied with its length of twine, sitting on the shelf above the fire. She thought, "What would you do?" The book, as books do, offered no reply. She put the kettle on, because there was nothing else to do, and because the ritual of small, ordinary tasks was the only shelter she knew how to build against the particular cold that had settled in her chest. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. In the village, names were traveling. Spring came the way it always did, not all at once, but in increments so small they were almost arguments rather than certainties. A morning when the ice on the water bucket was thinner than it had been the day before. A week when the light stayed past 5 o'clock, then past 6, lingering with a new tentativeness, as though testing whether it was truly welcome. The first mud in the road, which was its own kind of misery, but also, Mercy had always thought, the most honest sign that winter was losing its hold. Mud meant softness, and softness meant yielding. And yielding meant that the frozen earth was beginning to remember what it was capable of. She planted her early seeds in the second week of April. This was, she recognized dimly, An act of faith to press seeds into the ground in the middle of everything that was happening required a belief that there would be a summer, that she would be here to tend what came up, that the ordinary cycle of growing things would continue regardless of what was being said about her in the village. She'd planted them anyway. The rumors had grown since Samuel's visit at her gate. She knew this not because anyone told her directly. That was not how such things worked, but because she could feel it in the texture of encounters. A pause that lasted a half-second too long. A greeting returned with slightly less warmth than it had been given. The wife of a deacon who had always been friendly now found reasons to look elsewhere when they passed. Small things. Almost nothing. And yet she had grown up in this village, and she knew how to read it the way you read weather, not from any single cloud, but from the quality of the light, the direction of the wind, the particular heaviness in the air that tells you, before any visible sign arrives, that something is coming. She tried to comport herself with absolute normalcy. She went to church. She sat in her pew. She said the responses and sang the psalms and folded her hands during the sermon and walked out the door with her eyes forward. She paid her accounts at Ingersoll's. She was polite and measured, and she laughed when laughing was appropriate, and she did not speak about the trials unless she was directly addressed. And when she was directly addressed, she said only that she prayed for resolution and for mercy for all concerned. She was careful in the way that innocence, once it understands it is being watched, learns to be careful, which is to say, in a way that looks nothing like itself. She was in the garden on a Thursday morning, her hands dark with new earth, when she heard the cart on the road. She did not look up immediately. Carts passed on that road regularly. It was the road to the village center, and there was always traffic. She was tamping down the soil around a row of early onion sets, moving along the row on her knees, focused on the work. But the cart slowed and stopped, and then there were footsteps on the path to her gate. She sat back on her heels and looked. There were 3 men. She knew 2 of them: Ezekiel Cheever, who served as a constable, a thin-faced man she had bought eggs from not 3 months past, and behind him, Thomas Putnam, whose daughter had spoken of a widow woman at the edge of the village who knew too much about plants. The 3rd man she did not know. Cheever held a folded paper. She rose from her knees slowly, brushing the earth from her hands against her apron, and stood and looked at them, and they looked at her, and for a moment nobody said anything at all, and the only sound was the wind in the new leaves and the distant complaint of a crow somewhere in the pines. "Mercy Olcott," Cheever said. "Yes," she said. He held out the paper. "I am come with a warrant for your examination, on the complaint of Thomas Putnam and several others, that you have committed acts of witchcraft upon the bodies of Putnam, Mary Walcott, and others of this village." She heard the words. She heard each one of them separately and clearly, the way you hear things when a part of your mind goes very still and simply receives, without yet attempting to process. Warrant, examination, complaint, witchcraft. She took the paper. It was real paper, with real ink, with her name written on it in a clerk's careful hand. Mercy Olcott, widow, residing at the southerly edge of Salem village. Real paper, which meant real consequence, which meant that the thing she had been half believing might pass or resolve or prove itself to have nothing to do with her had not passed and had not resolved and had very much to do with her. "You are to come with us," Cheever said. His voice was not unkind. This was, somehow, almost worse. "For examination before the magistrates." "Now," she said. "Now." She looked at the garden, the row of onion sets only half-tamped, the trowel lying in the earth, the small neat furrows she had drawn with her finger. She looked at the house, the door standing open, The fire she had banked that morning. Patience, who was sitting in the doorway watching all of this with the unreadable attention that cats bring to moments of human crisis. "May I wash my hands?" she said. "I have been in the garden." Cheever looked briefly at Thomas Putnam. Putnam's expression was the expression of a man who has done something he considers righteous and is committed, now, to its righteousness. "Quickly," Cheever said. She went inside. She stood at the wash basin and poured water over her hands and watched the garden earth run off in dark rivulets. She dried her hands on the cloth beside the basin. She picked up her shawl from the peg by the door. She looked at her room, her fire, her shelves of dried herbs and her mother's book and the cat blinking slowly in the doorway. She thought, "I will be back by evening. This is a misunderstanding. I will speak plainly and clearly and they will see." She thought, "I should not leave the fire like that." She went to the hearth and moved the kettle off the heat and settled the fire guard in place, because she was a careful woman and careful women do not leave fires unattended. And then she walked back to the door. "I am ready," she said. The cart ride to the village was not long, perhaps 20 minutes along the road she had walked 100 times. The same trees, the same curves, the same houses she knew by name and family. She sat in the back of the cart with Cheever beside her and the third man driving, and Thomas Putnam rode his own horse alongside. And the world continued its ordinary April business. All around them a woman hanging washing, a child chasing something through a yard, the blacksmith's hammer ringing from the forge, and she looked at all of it with the peculiar attention of someone who is trying to memorize something without knowing why. She passed the forge. She did not see Samuel. The meeting house was full when they arrived. She had known it would be by now. An examination was a form of public event, something people came to witness. She recognized faces as she was led to the front of the room. Neighbors, acquaintances, people she had known for years. Their expressions were a complicated mixture of things: curiosity, unease, a terrible sympathy in some, and in others a settled certainty that she recognized with a cold clarity as having already decided. Magistrate Hathorn sat at a long table with his papers before him. He looked up at her when she was placed before him. "Mercy Olcott," he said, "you stand accused of witchcraft. How do you answer?" She had thought, on the ride over, about what she would say. She had rehearsed the words in her mind with the care of a woman who understands that words, in a room like this one, are the only tool she has. "I am innocent," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Afterward, in the private accounting she made of herself. "Before God and before this court, I have done no harm to any person living. I am a faithful woman and a law-abiding woman, and I cannot confess to what I have not done." From the front pew, one of the girls made a soft, broken sound. Hathorn looked at her over his papers. "We shall see," he said, "what the afflicted have to say." The examination lasted 4 hours. She would not have been able to say that with certainty at the time. Time moved strangely inside that room, sometimes stretching into long, viscous minutes that seemed to congeal around a single moment, and sometimes compressing, so that she would look up and find that an hour had passed in what felt like 10 minutes. But 4 hours was what she was told afterward, and she accepted the number without surprise. It felt like 4 hours. Hathorn began with her name, her place of residence, her occupation, her attendance at meeting. These were the preliminary questions, the ones that still bore some resemblance to an ordinary inquiry, and she answered them precisely and without elaboration, because she had understood from the first minutes in that room that elaboration was not her friend. Every additional word was a thread that could be pulled. Then he moved to the substance of the accusations. It has been testified, he said, in the measured tone of a man reading from an internal document, that your shape has appeared to Ann Putnam in her afflictions and has pinched and bitten her. What do you say to this? I say it is not possible, Mercy said. I have not been near Ann Putnam in her afflictions. I have been in my own house. Are you certain of this? I am. And yet the child has named you. She has described your shape with particularity. She has said you came to her in the night and pressed upon her chest and demanded she sign the devil's book. I have never done such a thing. I have never seen the devil's book, nor have I any knowledge of it. Hathorn looked at her steadily. He was not a theatrical man. He did not perform his authority. He simply inhabited it, which was in some ways more difficult to argue against than theatrics would have been. Do you believe, he said, that the afflicted children suffer? It was a careful question. She recognized it as such. I believe they suffer, she said. I do not know the cause of their suffering. Do you believe the devil exists and may afflict the bodies of the innocent? I believe the devil exists. Then you allow it is possible that he works through human instruments. I allow that he may. I deny that I am such an instrument. From the front pew came the sound she had been bracing for since she entered the room. And Putnam, 12 years old, thin-faced, with the particular intensity of a child who has learned that intensity commands attention, cried out and covered her eyes. Beside her, Mary Walcott made a sound that was almost musical in its anguish, and bent forward as though something were pressing on her shoulders. Elizabeth Hubbard raised her hand and pointed at Mercy with a trembling arm. She does it now, someone called from the gallery. She torments them now. The room shifted. Mercy felt it a physical thing, like the air-changing pressure before a storm. The attention of 60 or 70 people swung from the magistrate's table to the girls and then to her, and there was in that collective gaze something that she had no word for, something between grief and appetite, a hunger for explanation that had fastened itself onto her as its answer. She stood very still. This was what she had decided in the cart on the way here, that whatever happened, she would be still, that she would not weep because weeping would be interpreted. She would not rage because rage would be interpreted. She would not collapse because collapse would be interpreted. She would be a standing woman who told the truth and let the truth do what it could. Are you afflicting these children? Hathorn asked her. I am not. Look at them. She looked, and Putnam's face was wet, her eyes pressed shut, her hands gripping the pew edge. Mercy felt something move through her, not guilt, because she had nothing to be guilty of, but a complicated grief, because whatever was happening to that child, something was happening, and it was real suffering even if its cause was not what this room believed it to be. I am sorry for their distress, she said. I have prayed for their recovery. If you are innocent, Hathorn said, why do they suffer more when they look upon you? There was no answer to this question. She understood that now, standing before it, understood it with the clarity that comes when a thing you have half known for weeks suddenly becomes fully visible. There was no answer because the question was not a question. It was a wall dressed as a question, and you could not walk through a wall by explaining yourself to it. She said, I do not know why they suffer. I know only that I am not the cause. Hathorn made a note. They brought witnesses. A woman named Goodwife Herrick testified that she had once purchased a remedy from Mercy for her husband's ague, and that the remedy had not worked, and that afterward her husband had suffered a decline she could not explain. She said this without visible malice indeed. She looked uncomfortable saying it, glancing sideways as she spoke, as though she was not entirely sure how she had come to be standing there, but she said it. A man named John Willard testified that he had seen a strange light in the window of Mercer's house on 3 separate nights past midnight, moving in a manner inconsistent with a candle. A girl of perhaps 15, whose name Mercy did not catch, testified that Mercy had once told her that the herbs of the field held more power than most people understood, which, presented in this room, in this light, became a thing with sinister dimensions that it had not possessed when spoken. Mercy listened to each of these testimonies with the fixed attention of someone who is trying to learn something, trying to understand the shape of the case being built around her, looking for the gap she might speak into, the place where reason might still find purchase. There was no such place. Each testimony, however slight, was accepted and recorded. Her responses that the remedy for ague sometimes simply did not work, as any honest herbalist would tell you, that she sometimes read late by candlelight, that she had meant nothing more sinister than that plants had properties that repaid study, were heard and noted and added to the pile without altering the pile's weight or direction. The afflicted girls reacted to her responses as they had been reacting all morning, with cries and gestures that the room interpreted as evidence of the pain her denials caused them. She began to understand, somewhere in the second hour, that this was not a proceeding in which evidence was weighed. It was a proceeding in which a conclusion was being dressed in the language of process. The conclusion had been reached before she entered the room. The examination was the ceremony by which that conclusion was made official. This understanding did not make her despair. She had not yet reached despair. What it made her was tired, a bone-deep, particular tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the effort of maintaining clarity in a room that was committed to confusion. In the 4th hour, they asked her to recite the Lord's Prayer. This was a test she knew about the belief that a witch could not recite sacred words without stumbling, that the devil's compact would tangle the tongue on holy syllables. She had run it through her mind on the cart ride over, the familiar words, worn smooth by 1,000 repetitions since childhood, and she had been confident. She stood before the room and she began, "Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." Her voice was steady. She was aware of every face in the room. "Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth, as it is in heaven." She was aware of the girls at the front, their eyes on her. "Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us." She was nearly through it. She could see the end of it from where she stood. "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us." She stopped, not because the words left her. She would insist on this. Privately, for the rest of her life, the words did not leave her. But in the fraction of a second before evil, the awareness of the room rushed in so completely, the weight of all those watching eyes, the knowledge of what a single stumble would mean, that her voice faltered on the threshold of the word. A half-breath, less, a pause so small it might, in any other room, have been nothing at all. In this room, it was everything. The murmur that moved through the gallery was not loud. It did not need to be. She recovered. She said the word. She completed the prayer, her voice still steady, her hands still still. But Hathorn had marked it. She could see that he had marked it. "Deliver us from evil," he repeated quietly, looking at his paper. The room held its breath. She looked out at the faces before her, neighbors, acquaintances, people she had lived among for 28 years, and she felt, for the first time, something that she would later understand had been the true beginning of the end. Not despair, not yet, but the slow, terrible recognition that the world she had known, the one in which she was Mercy Alcott, widow, herbalist, careful woman who moved the kettle off the fire before she left that world was not going to be available to her for much longer. The world that was replacing it had already decided what she was, and there was nothing, no word she could speak, no prayer she could complete, no truth she could offer that would change it. The prison was in Salem town, not Salem village, a distinction that required a longer cart ride through an afternoon that had turned gray and close, the sky the color of old pewter, the road soft from recent rain. She was not manacled. She noted this with a dim, detached gratitude. Shiva had the decency, or perhaps simply the indifference, not to chain her for the journey. She sat in the back of the cart and watched the landscape move past and tried to fix things in her memory, the particular lean of a familiar elm at the road's bend, the way the light fell flat across a field of new green wheat, a red-winged blackbird on a fence post who watched the cart pass with complete composure. She thought, remember this, remember the blackbird. She did not know why that seemed important. It simply did. The Salem jail was not a place designed for the comfort of its occupants. This was not a surprise. She had not expected comfort, but the reality of it still required a moment of adjustment when the door was opened and she was led inside. It was dark, even in the afternoon, the small windows set high in thick stone walls admitting light in thin, reluctant columns. It was cold in the way that stone buildings are cold, not the sharp, clean cold of winter air, but something damp and settled, a cold that had lived in the walls for years and saw no reason to leave. The smell was of straw and unwashed bodies, and beneath it something older and harder to name, the smell of accumulated fear and waiting. She was placed in a cell with two other women. She knew them both. The first was Martha Corey, a stout, practical woman in her 60s who had been among the first of the respectable village members to be accused, and whose examination Mercy had heard described in fragmentary, troubled terms by Rebecca Nurse some weeks prior. Martha looked up when Mercy was brought in and nodded with the matter-of-fact equanimity of someone who has been in a bad situation long enough to have found their footing in it. The second was Rebecca Nurse herself. Mercy stopped in the doorway when she saw her. Rebecca was seated on the straw against the far wall, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed, not sleeping, Mercy thought, but praying, or something that looked from the outside like the same thing. She was 71 years old, and she had raised 8 children, and she had been a member of the Salem Village Church for longer than most of its current members had been alive, and she was sitting in a prison cell on a charge of witchcraft, and she opened her eyes when she heard the door and looked at Mercy, and her expression did something complicated that resolved, after a moment, into simple recognition. "Mercy," she said. "Rebecca," Mercy said. She crossed the cell and sat beside her on the straw, and for a while neither of them said anything. And the silence between them was the particular silence of two people who have known each other long enough to understand that some moments do not require words. Then Rebecca said, quietly, "How did they find you?" "Steady," Mercy said. "I was steady." Rebecca nodded as though this was exactly what she had expected, which was one of the more comforting things she could have done. The days inside the prison had a texture entirely unlike the days outside it. Outside, time was organized by light, the gradations of morning into afternoon, into evening, into the particular deep blue of a New England dusk. In the cell, the light came and went through the high windows with a remoteness that made it feel like something happening elsewhere, something you were watching rather than inhabiting. The days were defined instead by the delivery of meals, a thin porridge in the morning, bread and water in the evening, and by the rhythm of the other women's breathing, and by the sounds of the prison around them, which were various and not always easy to interpret. She slept badly for the first several nights. This was not surprising. She lay on the straw in the dark and listened to Martha Coy's steady breathing and Rebecca's quieter, light asleep in the distant sounds of the jail, and she thought about her house, the fire guard she had placed before she left, the onion sets half-tamped in the garden. Patience, the cat who would have sat in the doorway for a while before understanding that no one was coming and making whatever arrangements cats make in such circumstances. She thought about her mother's book, still on the shelf above the hearth. She thought about the blackbird on the fence post. She did not, in those first nights, allow herself to think too far forward. Forward was a country she did not have enough information to navigate, and so she stayed, as much as she could, in the small compass of the present. The texture of the straw beneath her, the sound of the other women, the thin light from the high window, shifting through its slow degrees. It was Rebecca who gave her the tools for this, not in any dramatic way, not with speeches or instruction, but simply by being what she was. Rebecca prayed in the mornings aloud, in a low voice, working through the Psalms with an unhurried thoroughness that made the Psalms sound like what they had perhaps always been, not performances of piety, but private conversations with something larger than circumstance. Mercy listened and found, to her faint surprise, that she was comforted. She began to pray that way herself. Not the structured prayers of the meeting house, with their formal architecture, but something simpler, just speaking, in the dark, in a low voice, about the things that were true. The beauty of the crocus pushing through the frost. The taste of bread still warm from her own oven. The particular color of the sky in February at 4 in the afternoon. The feeling of earth between her fingers. Gratitude, she found, was a structure you could live inside if you built it carefully enough. This was not the same as peace. She was not at peace. She was frightened, and she was angry in a way she kept very carefully contained because she understood that anger, expressed, would be used against her. She missed her house with a physical ache, the way you miss a limb. She worried, with a persistent low-grade anxiety, about what was happening to the onion sets, the dried herbs, the fire guard she had left in place. But inside the fear and the anger and the missing, she found something she had not expected to find in a prison cell, a stripped-down version of herself that she recognized from the quiet of her best winter mornings. The self that was just breath and awareness. The self that existed before and below the social mercy, the careful mercy, the mercy who moved through the world with such attention to its surfaces. She had not known, before, that she could find that self anywhere outside of her own kitchen in the dark before dawn. She was almost grateful for the knowing. Almost. Samuel came on a Thursday, the second week of her confinement. He was allowed a brief visit. Prisoners were permitted visitors, which surprised her slightly, the system having more seams in it than she had imagined. He stood in the doorway of the cell and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, a kind of desperate steadiness, a man holding himself still by an act of will. She stood to meet him. She was aware of how she must look in the same dress she had been arrested in, the straw, the pall light. She found she was not embarrassed by this. That, too, surprised her slightly. "Are you well?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I am well enough," she said. "How is the village?" Something passed across his face. "Loud," he said. Then, more names. Every week, more names. "Rebecca will be tried soon," she said. "Yes." He looked at his hands briefly. "I have spoken to a man, a lawyer of sorts, in Boston, who has some acquaintance with these proceedings. He says," he paused. "He says that a plea of innocence maintained throughout has not yet served anyone well before this court." She understood what he was not quite saying. "He means I should confess," she said. He said nothing, which was its own answer. She looked at him for a moment, this young man with his honest face and his hat in his hands, who had come to a prison to tell her that lying might save her life. She felt a tenderness toward him so acute it was almost indistinguishable from pain. "I cannot confess to what I have not done," she said. "Mercy, I know what you are telling me. I understand the reasoning of it. But if I confess, I name myself a witch before God, and I name others besides. That is how it works. They will ask me for names, and I will not name innocent people." She kept her voice quiet. "I would rather be honestly dead than dishonestly alive." He looked at her for a long time. "I know," he said finally. And the way he said it told her he had known before he came, had known and come anyway, because coming was the only thing he could offer, and he was the kind of person who offered what he had. He left after a few more minutes, the practical minutes of a visit that had already said everything it needed to say. She watched him go down the corridor and turn the corner, and she stood in the doorway of the cell for a moment after he was gone. "I would rather be honestly dead than dishonestly alive." She turned the words over in her mind, feeling their edges. She had not known she believed that until she said it, but she found, standing in the bad light of a prison corridor, that she believed it completely. Martha Coy, from her corner of the cell, said quietly, "Well said." Mercy looked at her. Martha shrugged, with a practicality that was almost funny. "I heard. These walls don't discriminate." Mercy returned to her place beside Rebecca on the straw. She sat down. She breathed. Outside the high window, a bird was singing one of the feist true spring songs, clear and unhurried, entirely indifferent to the walls around it. She listened until it stopped. The Court of Oyer and Termina was established in late May by order of the new governor, Sir William Phipps, who had arrived from England to find his colony in a state of considerable agitation, and had responded by creating a special court with the authority to try the witchcraft cases that had accumulated through the spring. Mercy learned of this from Martha Coy, who had a talent for extracting information from the gods with a combination of practicality and mild charm that Mercy had come to genuinely admire. Martha said, "A special court," in the tone of a woman who understands exactly what special means in this context, which is that it means fast. And fast means that the ordinary deliberations of a careful legal process are not what anyone is intending. The first trials were held in June. Bridget Bishop was tried and hanged on the 10th. The news came into the prison the way all news came, in fragments, carried by guards and visitors, and the particular acoustic quality of the building, which conveyed conversations from one room to another with an intimacy it had not been designed to provide. Mercy heard it in pieces and assembled it in her mind the way you assemble a thing you are not certain you want to see whole. Hanged. On Gallows Hill. The first. She sat with that for a long time. Not with panic. She had moved past the register of panic somewhere in the second week of her confinement, into something quieter and more fundamental. She sat with it the way you sit with a fact that has made the world irreversibly different from what it was before you knew it. Bridget Bishop was dead. The court was moving. This was the direction they were all traveling in, and the distance remaining was now a matter of weeks rather than months. Rebecca took the news with her characteristic stillness. She prayed for Bridget Bishop's soul, aloud, in a voice that did not waver. Then she was quiet for the rest of the day, and Mercy sat beside her and was quiet too, and Martha gave them both the dignity of not speaking, which was its own form of grace. Mercy's trial was set for the last week of June. She was given no counsel. This was not unusual. The court did not provide it, and though she had hoped Samuel might find the Boston lawyer he had mentioned, He came to visit again in mid-June with the quiet apology of a man who has discovered that the machinery of a thing is more intractable than he had believed, and that the lawyer, having looked more carefully at the shape of the proceedings, had declined to become involved. She thanked him for trying. She meant it. She spent the week before her trial in the particular state of mind that she imagined soldiers must know before a battle, not calm exactly, but something adjacent to it, a simplification. The complex social creature she had been, the woman who weighed her words and read her neighbors' expressions and navigated the fine textures of village life, that woman had been steadily stripped away by the weeks in the cell, and what remained was something more fundamental. Her bones and breath, and the knowledge of what she believed and what she would not say. She went through her testimony in her mind, not rehearsing it so much as settling it the way you settle a fire for the night, ensuring it is stable enough to last. She knew what she would say. She had always known. She would say, "I am innocent." She would say it clearly, and she would say it as many times as they asked, and she would not elaborate beyond what was necessary because elaboration invited distortion, and she would not confess because she had nothing to confess, and she would not name others because there were no others to name. This was not a strategy for survival. She understood that. It was simply the truth, and she had decided on the night she said, "I would rather be honestly dead than dishonestly alive," and on every night since that the truth was what she had, and she would give it. The court sat in a building in Salem town that was larger than the meeting house, or perhaps it simply felt larger, being unfamiliar. She was brought in through a side door and placed before the judges, 5 of them seated behind a long table with a gravity that was partly, she thought, the gravity of occasion, and partly the gravity of men who have committed to a course of action and find commitment a reasonable substitute for certainty. Chief Judge Stoughton presided. He was a different instrument from Hathorne, where Hathorne was methodical. Stoughton was deliberate in a way that felt like velocity, a man moving through the proceedings with the momentum of someone who knows where he is going and does not intend to stop and look around. The charges were read. She confirmed her name, her age, her residence. She entered her plea. "Not guilty," she said. "Before God and this court, not guilty." The afflicted girls were present. They were always present, their suffering a kind of weather that the room moved within. She looked at them when she entered, and she looked away, because looking at them for too long did something to her that she could not afford. Not anger, she had thought it would be anger, and was surprised to find it was something closer to sorrow. Whatever the cause of their affliction, they were suffering, and they were young, and they were caught inside something that had grown larger than any of them. The witnesses testified. It was, in its broad shape, the examination again, the same structure, the same logic, the same conclusion dressed in different particulars. A man who had once passed her house at night and seen a light. A woman who had dreamed of her and woken frightened. The testimony of the afflicted girls themselves, given with a conviction that the room received as evidence. There was one moment that she had not expected. A woman she barely knew, the wife of a carpenter from the outer edge of the village, a woman she had perhaps exchanged 20 words with across the entirety of her life, stood up in the gallery without being called and said, in a carrying voice, that she had known Mercy Alcott for 6 years and had never known her to be anything other than a decent and godly woman, and that she did not believe one word of what was being said about her. The judge told the woman to sit down. The woman sat down. But she had said it. It was in the room. It had been heard. Mercy looked at her from across the court, this woman whose name she could not quite place, this stranger who had stood up in a room full of people committed to a verdict and said a true thing out loud at cost to herself, and she felt something move through her chest that she could not name precisely, something between gratitude and grief and love for the particular stubbornness of human decency, the way it persisted in the most inhospitable conditions, the way it kept showing up even when it could not change anything. She held that feeling carefully. It was a real thing, and real things were worth holding. The jury retired. She was taken to a small room to wait. It was a plain room, a bench, a window, a guard at the door. The window looked out onto a courtyard where a horse was tied to a post, standing in the afternoon sun with its eyes half closed and one hind foot cocked in the easy patience of an animal that has learned to wait without anguish. She watched it for a long time. She thought about her garden. The onion sets would have come up by now. She realized it was late June. They should be several inches tall, green and thin and smelling clean when you bruised them. The chamomile would be flowering in the wild corner. The lavender would be coming on. She moved through it in her mind, plant by plant, the way you walk a familiar path, not trying to hold on to it, just letting the walking be its own comfort. She thought about her mother's book. She hoped it was still on the shelf. She thought about Patience, and allowed herself to hope that Patience had found someone to feed her. Cats were resourceful. Patience in particular had always seemed to regard human beings as a convenience rather than a necessity, which was probably a healthy arrangement. She thought about the blackbird on the fence post on the cart ride to the jail, watching the cart pass with such composure. She thought, I have had a good life, small and quiet, and mostly mine. I have known how to make things grow. I have known one or two people well enough to love them. I have had mornings in my own kitchen with the fire going and the light coming through the shutters, and I have been, on balance, content. She thought, that is enough. That is more than many people get. She was not crying. She was simply accounting, taking stock of what she had been given, as you take stock of a pantry before a long winter honestly, without sentimentality, knowing the number is the number and the number is enough. The guard opened the door. They are ready for you, he said. She stood. She smoothed her skirt, which was a thing she did by habit, her hands knowing the gesture before her mind requested it, the gesture of a woman preparing to be seen, the small ordinary dignity of it. She walked back into the court. Stoughton looked at her across the room, and she looked back at him, and in the space between them the verdict existed already, complete and settled, before it was spoken. He read it. She heard it. She did not flinch. She stood in the bright, terrible clarity of what had just been said, and she breathed, and she was still, and she thought about the horse in the courtyard with its eyes half closed in the afternoon sun, waiting without anguish, guilty. Outside, the summer continued, as summer does. They did not set a date immediately. This was, in its way, a mercy, though she was careful not to use that word, even in her own mind, not wanting to spend the particular irony of it carelessly. There were petitions being filed on behalf of several of the condemned, and the machinery of the court moved at its own pace. And so the women of Mercer's cell found themselves in the strange position of having been sentenced without knowing precisely when the sentence would be carried out. She had expected this period to be the worst. She had imagined, in the weeks before the trial, that a verdict would collapse something in her, that the walls of the careful interior she had built would finally give way and she would find herself in the rubble of it. But the walls held. She was not certain why. Perhaps because she had already done her accounting in the waiting room before the verdict. She had already added up what she'd been given and found the sum sufficient, and a verdict could not unmake that accounting. Perhaps because there was still something to do, still a present tense to inhabit, still breath and light and the small daily textures of existing, and she had learned, over these weeks, to find enough in those. Or perhaps it was simply that the body continues its business regardless, and the continuation of the body carries the spirit along with it. And that is a kind of grace that asks nothing in return. She slept better in those weeks after the verdict than she had in all her weeks of confinement before it. This struck her as strange, and then it struck her as correct. The uncertainty had been a weight she had not fully understood until it was lifted. People came to see her. This surprised her. She had expected, after the verdict, a kind of social quarantine, that those who remained free would keep their distance from the condemned, either from fear of association or from the simpler human reluctance to spend time near grief you cannot fix. But they came. Samuel came twice a week, every week, with the regularity of a man who has decided on a thing and intends to see it through. He brought small items when the gods allowed it. A piece of good bread once, a small bunch of herbs tied with twine that she held for a long time before identifying them by smell, rosemary and lavender, from someone's garden. And she understood without being told that he had asked someone what to bring and had been told, and had brought them. She pressed the bundle between her palms and breathed it in and said thank you in a voice that was steadier than she had expected. He talked to her about ordinary things. The forge, the weather, a dispute between two families over a boundary line that had been going on for so long it had outlasted its original participants and been inherited by their children like a piece of furniture. He talked about these things with the deliberate attention of a man who understands that the ordinary world is a gift he can offer, that keeping it present and real and detailed is a form of care. She was grateful for it in a way that went beyond words. So she used words anyway, because they were what she had. Tell me about the boundary dispute, she would say, and he would tell her, and the telling was a thread between her cell and the world outside it, thin but real, holding. The woman from the gallery came once. Her name, Mercy finally learned, was Hannah Clark, and she was 34 years old. And her husband was the carpenter from the village's outer edge, and she had 3 children and a kitchen garden and a life of ordinary dimensions that she had been putting quietly at risk by coming here. She sat across from Mercy with her hands folded and her eyes direct, and she said, I want you to know that I do not believe it. I have never believed it. I know, Mercy said. I saw you stand up. It was not enough. It was something. It was the truest thing said in that room. Hannah Clark looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read, complicated by guilt, Mercy thought, and also by something else, something like the look of a person trying to memorize a face. Is there anything I can do? She said. Anything at all? Mercy thought about it seriously, because the question deserved seriousness. My cat, she said at last. Her name is Patience. She is gray. She will be managing on her own, but she is not young, and I would be glad to know she was being fed. Something in Hannah Clark's face eased slightly, not because the request was small, but because it was real, and real things are easier to hold than large helpless ones. I will find her, she said. I promise. Thank you, Mercy said. After Hannah left, Mercy sat for a while with the particular warm ache of having been seen by a stranger who chose to look. It was a feeling she kept returning to in the days that followed taking it out and examining it the way you examine something beautiful that you have found unexpectedly, turning it in the light. Rebecca Nurse was taken to Gallows Hill on the 19th of July. Mercy was not there. None of them were in the cell, and they knew, and they sat together and did not speak very much. And Martha Corey prayed in her practical way, and Mercy held Rebecca's absence in the room the way you hold something that has weight but no shape. She thought about the walk to Rebecca's house along the Ipswich Road in the snow, the steam of the tea, the comfrey salve, the way Rebecca had said I know it when Mercy mentioned valerian, with the tone of a woman whose knowledge was also inherited, also passed down through women's hands, also older than the village's understanding of it. She thought about Rebecca saying her name in the cell, that first evening. Mercy. Just her name. The way someone says a name when they are glad the person the name belongs to is there. She thought, the world is diminished. Not in a despairing way, or not only in a despairing way. In a true way. Rebecca Nurse had been in the world for 71 years, and she had made it better by her presence in the specific and particular way that good people do, and now she was not in it, and the world was different for her absence, and that was real and it mattered and it deserved to be said plainly. She said it plainly, alone in her corner of the cell that night, speaking to no one and everyone. Then she lay down on the straw and looked up at the dark ceiling and breathed, and found, after a while, the gratitude practice, the garden, the mornings, the blackbird, the rosemary and lavender, Hannah Clark's voice saying, I do not believe it, Samuel's steady Tuesday visits, the sound of Rebecca praying in the mornings, the feel of her mother's book in her hands, the crocus through the frost, and she moved through it slowly, item by item, like fingers moving through beads. She slept. There was a morning, about a week before the end, when the light came through the high window at an angle she had not seen before, the late summer angle, the one that means the days are already beginning to shorten again without anyone quite noticing. She lay on the straw and watched the column of light move slowly across the wall, and she thought about how many mornings she had watched light move across walls and floors and garden beds and roads, and how she had never once thought to count them or hold them, because they had always seemed like something that would simply keep arriving. She reached into the light with one hand and held it there for a moment, the warmth of it real and present on her skin. She thought, there it is. There it is. She was not afraid. She wanted to record that. Somewhere, for whoever might be listening in the last weeks, she was not afraid. She was sad, and she was sorry for the sadness she was leaving in others, and she was angry, still, in the contained way she had been angry since the beginning, at the machinery that had done this thing. But she was not afraid of what was coming, because she had looked at it steadily for long enough that it had lost its power to terrify, and what remained when the terror lifted was just the next true thing, and she had always been able to walk toward the next true thing. She had built a whole life out of walking toward true things. She thought of her mother, of the book tied with twine, of the way knowledge passes from hands to hands across generations, in the patient way that seeds pass not dramatically, not in speeches, but in the quiet transmission of one person showing another person how to do a real thing in the real world. She had not had children to pass it to. She felt the lack of that, honestly, without dressing it as something other than what it was, a sadness, a small one, in the accounting, outweighed. But Hannah Clark had 3 children, and Hannah Clark was going to feed patients, and Hannah Clark had stood up in a courtroom and said a true thing at cost to herself, and Hannah Clark would go home tonight to her kitchen garden and her ordinary life, and she would carry in her chest, for the rest of her life, the knowledge of what she had seen and what she had chosen, and that knowledge would be part of how she moved through the world, and it would touch the people around her, and some of what was good in Mercer's life, the knowing that plants repaid study, the practice of gratitude, the stubbornness of decency would travel on in that, invisibly, the way things travel. She was not nothing. She had never been nothing. She reached into the light again, and held it, and let it be warm on her hand, and then the morning settled into itself, and the day began, and there were only a few days left, and she was ready. She knew the day when it arrived, not because anyone told her the gods were not given to announcement, and the morning began like any other morning, with the thin early light and the distant sounds of the building waking, but she knew it the way you know things that live in the body rather than the mind, a certainty that settled into her chest sometime in the hours before dawn and stayed there, still and clear. She had been awake since before the light. She lay on the straw, and she did what she had learned to do. She moved through it. The garden, the mornings, the bread still warm, the crocus through the frost, Rebecca's voice saying her name, Samuel's steady visits, the rosemary and lavender in her hands, Hannah Clark standing up in a room full of people and saying a true thing, the blackbird on the fence post, the light through the shutters of her own kitchen, thin and pale and winter careful, the feel of her mother's book, the cover worn smooth, the twine holding it together, the feel of earth between her fingers, in April, pressing seeds in. She held each one. She set each one down. She breathed. Martha Corey woke sometime in the middle of this. Mercy heard her shift and settle and go still again, and then after a moment heard her begin to pray in her quiet, practical way. And the sound of Martha praying in the dark was a companionship Mercy was grateful for, though she did not say so. Some things do not need saying. After all these weeks together, they had learned that, the three of them, the grammar of a shared cell, which words to use and which to let be present without language. She thought, I am glad I was not alone in this. She had not expected to be glad of that. Going in, she was a solitary woman by nature, had always kept her own company without difficulty, had built her life around the quiet of her own house. But the cell had given her Martha's practicality and Rebecca's faith and the particular companionship of women who are enduring a hard thing together, and she found she had been enlarged by it in some way she could not precisely name. Not despite the hardship, partly because of it. People contain more than ordinary life asks them to show. She had always suspected this. Now she knew it. The God came at first light. He was a young man, younger than she had realized, in the low light of the cell. He could not have been more than 20, with the careful face of someone who is trying to perform a professional composure he has not quite finished growing into. She felt a brief, involuntary tenderness toward him. He had not asked for this morning any more than she had. He told her it was time. She stood. She smoothed her skirt, the same gesture, the same hands, knowing it before her mind asked, and she put her shawl around her shoulders, though it was a warm morning and the shawl was not necessary. It had been Thomas's mother's shawl, a deep blue wool worn soft as cloth, and she had been wearing it the day she was arrested, and she intended to wear it today, because it was hers and it was beautiful, and beauty was worth carrying as far as you could carry it. Martha was sitting up, watching her. Their eyes met. Martha said nothing, which was everything. Mercy nodded once. She walked to the cell door, and through it, and down the corridor she had walked in 2 months ago when Chiva led her in, and the smell of the place had required adjusting to. And she noticed now that she no longer noticed the smell, which was the body's small mercy to itself, that it adjusts, that it stops registering the inescapable as assault and simply incorporates it. The corridor was narrow and the walls were stone, and the light was just beginning to come through the high windows in its thin, careful summer way. And she walked through it, and she breathed, and she was present, and she was herself, and she was Mercy Alcott, who knew how to make things grow. Outside, the air hit her first. She had forgotten, in 2 months of stone and straw, what outside air smelled like, or not forgotten exactly, but the memory of it had become abstract, a concept rather than a sensation, and the reality of it now was startling in its fullness, warm and green and faintly sweet, the particular August smell of a New England morning that carries in it everything that is growing without announcement, grass and earth, and somewhere, not far, something flowering. She stood in the yard for a moment and simply breathed it. The sky was enormous. She had forgotten that too, how enormous the sky was, how it simply went on, blue and pale and airy, without walls or ceiling, with the light coming from the east in long low angles that turned everything it touched to gold for just this hour. She looked up at it. She let it be as large as it was. There were other people in the yard. She registered them, peripherally guards, a minister she did not know, others, but she did not look at them directly. She was looking at the sky and the light and breathing the air, and these seemed like the important things to do with the time that remained. The minister approached her. He was an older man with a kind face and the slightly desperate look of someone who wants very much to be of use and is not certain he knows how. He said that he would pray with her, if she would like. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." They prayed together, standing in the yard, and the prayer was one of the old ones, the 23rd Psalm, which she knew from childhood, which she had prayed so many times across the years that the words lived in her body rather than just her mind. "The Lord is my shepherd." She had always loved the pastoral imagery of it, the green pastures, the still waters, the restoration of the soul. She had always thought whoever wrote it must have understood what it was to find peace in growing things, in the natural world, in the honest labor of tending. "Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." She said that part clearly. She meant it. There was a cart and a road and Gallows Hill. She would not describe the road in detail. She had her sky and her air and the feel of Thomas's mother's shawl around her shoulders, and she moved through the rest of it the way you move through weather, present within it, not separate from it, but not consumed by it either. She had always known how to be in weather. It was one of the things her life had taught her. The hill was higher than she remembered from having seen it distantly across the landscape, or perhaps it was only that everything was more vivid now, the senses sharpened by the knowledge that they would not have much longer to report. The sky was fully light by the time they arrived, that particular clear blue that comes after a warm night, and the trees at the hill's edges were deep summer green, so green it almost ached to look at. She looked at it. She was not going to spend this on looking at the ground. There were people gathered. She registered this without focusing on it. A crowd, as there were always crowds at these things, the same human draw toward witnessed event that she had observed at the examination and tried to understand. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel about the crowd, not contempt, not anguish. Something closer to sadness, the complex sadness of watching people be what people are, with all their fear and curiosity and capacity for both cruelty and its opposite. She looked at the sky instead. She thought about her garden. She thought about the onion sets she had tamped only halfway before Cheever came down the path. By now they would have grown and flowered and gone to seed. That was how time worked, things completing themselves regardless of whether the planter was there to watch. She found she was glad of that. The garden did not require her. It had its own logic, its own cycle, its own patient insistence on continuing. She thought about seeds. She thought about how a seed contains, in miniature, the whole structure of what it will become, every root and stem and leaf and flower folded into a thing so small you can hold 100 of them in your palm. How that potential is simply there, waiting for the right conditions, requiring only warmth and water and time. She thought, something of me is a seed. Not mystically, concretely. Hannah Clark would feed patience and carry in her chest what she had seen. Samuel would continue at the forge and be the kind of man who comes twice a week to sit with someone and talk about ordinary things when that is all he can offer, and he would be that kind of man because he had practiced being it here, in these visits. and the practice would become character, and the character would shape the people around him. Her mother's knowledge was in her hands and in the margins of the book on the shelf, and in every person she had ever given a remedy or a packet of dried herbs or a word about which plants repaid study. It went on. Things went on. She breathed. The minister was speaking. She heard him distantly, the words of another old prayer, and she let them wash over her like water, familiar and clean. She kept her eyes on the sky, the blue of it, the absolute and indifferent and beautiful blue of it. She thought of the morning she had stood at her kitchen window watching the snow fall in the dark, the slow enormous flakes, the whole world breathing. She thought, that was enough. That was the whole thing. Right there. That was the whole of it. She breathed in. She breathed out. The sky was very blue. The trees were very green. The air smelled of August. She was Mercy Alcott, a widow, 28 years old, who knew how to make things grow and how to be still inside the difficult thing and how to hold a day's light in her hands and call it enough. She was not afraid. She breathed in. Mercy Alcott does not appear in the historical record. She is one of the unnamed, one of the many women whose lives the hysteria of 1692 touched and took, who left no document, no testimony, no trace signature. She is made of the fragments of the real women who were there, Rebecca Nice, Martha Corey, Bridget Bishop, and the others whose names we know, and the others whose names we do not. 19 people were hanged on Gallows Hill between June and September of 1692. Many more died in prison. One man was pressed to death with stones. Their convictions were reversed by the Massachusetts legislature in 1711. The apologies came slowly across centuries and are still coming. The Book of Herbs is still on the shelf in every house where someone learned from someone else how to tend a growing thing. The seeds go on. This concludes the story. Sleep well. Good night.